translate it for all because that'll make the author's meaning clearer. But by the late 1990s, people had seen in liturgical circles that dynamic equivalence translations were becoming rather untethered from the actual base text. And so there was a movement to shift things back in the direction of what's called a formal equivalence translation, where you do go more word for word rather than thought for thought. And so the Vatican revised the advice it had given. In the 1970s, there was a translation document that had come out called Comme le prévoit. It was a French document, but it was advising local bishops' conferences about how to translate the texts of the liturgy, and it endorsed a dynamic equivalence view. But by the 1990s, the Vatican was mandating a more formal equivalence view. And so that I think is the principal reason why it took so long for this to be addressed. Also, I should note this only occurred in some languages, and so it wasn't like a global problem that affected the entire Western Church. It affected certain countries, but it didn't affect everybody. And that meant that the issue, to the extent it was a source of controversy, it kind of bottled up that controversy in particular countries. And as a result, the Vatican, which has a global approach to things, didn't feel the need for a long time to intervene on the subject. But that's Danielle's first question. Why don't you read her second, Si?
Okay, so because that goes right into her second question, which was, did other countries interpret the translation differently? And did it cause disunity and uproar? What was the bishop's response?
Well, the translations varied between different countries. Some countries had translations that used for many, other countries had translations that used for all. There wasn't really any general disunity or uproar. Frankly, this is something that only became controversial within traditionalist communities. And frankly, it's nitpicking. Now, I agree. I'm a fan of translating it for many because I like formal equivalence translations. But when Jesus says that he shed his blood for many, he means for all. He really died for all mankind. So it's not false to translate it that way. It doesn't communicate any kind of error to translate it that way. And so this is a nitpicky thing. And that, frankly, is another reason that this wasn't the subject of an earlier revision, because it just wasn't causing that big of a problem. It was causing a problem, but in small traditionalist communities scattered here and there, not everywhere in the world in the Latin Rite. People were not rioting in the streets over this.
So then she concludes with this question: can a true pope give us a mistranslation ex cathedra?
Not ex cathedra. If the pope speaks ex cathedra, then he is whatever he says is guaranteed to be true. And therefore, if he were to invoke his infallibility and say, this word in this language or this phrase in this language means this, then that would be a true statement, because God would be protecting him from error in saying it. So it would have to be some kind of a genuine translation. Maybe not the only translation, maybe not the best translation, but it would be a genuine translation that was, accurate. So that couldn't happen, but that hasn't happened. The Pope has never tried to invoke his infallibility. No Pope has ever tried to invoke his infallibility regarding the translation of the Mass.
Danielle, thank you.
Into Latin or anything else.
Okay, thank you, Danielle, very much for the question. That brings us to a question from Jason, who says, Jimmy, I would love to hear Jimmy Akin's response to the following. What was the defining factor that caused Nathanael to go from saying, can anything good come from Nazareth, to proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God? Also, what is the significance of the fig tree? Was Nathanael praying under the fig tree? Thank you.
Okay, so this story is found in John 1. And so you can look it up there if you want to read the story for yourself. Basically, we have Philip and Andrew and other early disciples of John the Baptist are meeting Jesus, and they're talking about him and who they found, and we've just found the Messiah. And Philip goes to Nathanael and tells Nathanael that we found the Messiah. It's Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael says, Jesus of Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That place?
Yeah.
And then Philip says, well, come and see. And so he introduces him to Jesus. And Jesus says, oh, hey, a true Israelite, someone who has no guile. Or if I were, guile's a bit of an uncommon word today, but if you were to translate it into a modern American idiom, which I will be delicate around because it's a family show. It's like, here's someone who won't give any BS.
Yeah.
He's blunt and honest about his opinions. Nazareth, something's good going to come out of that place. So Nathanael is kind of stunned and says, well, wait a minute, how do you know me? And Jesus says, when you were sitting under the fig tree the previous day, I saw you. So Jesus has been remote viewing here. And Nathanael at that point exclaims that Jesus is the Son of God and the King of Israel. So what was the thing, in keeping with Jason's question, about that? What was the key thing that caused him to go from can anything good come out of Nazareth to proclaiming Jesus the Son of God? Well, essentially, it's the framing of this sequence of events. Philip has come to him and given him an interpretation. Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. And then when he meets Jesus of Nazareth displays supernatural knowledge of Nathanael. And that tells him, oh, so Jesus has supernatural knowledge. He's a prophet. Something good has come out of Nazareth. That interpretation, that framing of he's the Messiah, that must be true. And so he concludes he's the Son of God and the King of Israel, both of which are messianic titles. So it was basically the framing interpretation he's given, Jesus is the Messiah, coupled with the fact Jesus has supernatural knowledge. And those two things put together, or that fact Jesus has supernatural knowledge, led him to conclude the framing he was given was true, that Jesus is the Messiah. When it comes to sitting under the fig tree, all we really know is he was sitting there. That's the normal thing. If someone says he was under a fig tree, or under an apple tree or whatever it may be, if you're not told anything else, you're going to think they're just sitting there. He would not have been praying, probably, because the typical prayer posture is what's known as the orans position, where you're standing and you got your arms out, and you're not going to be doing that if you're sitting under a fig tree. So the significance of the fig tree is just that Jesus was able to identify where he was. And it's not significant beyond that.
Thank you for those. For that. Well, I guess it's those questions. Appreciate the getting it to us, and people get these questions to us all different kinds of ways. They get it to us, internet, email. Maybe they send it by pigeon to Jimmy. I don't know. But we gather them up, as Jimmy said, and we give them to Jimmy for answers. It's an open forum, but it's an internet open forum. We'll continue that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live with Jimmy Akin is coming right back.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
The Catholic Gentleman Podcast is a show for Catholic men on the topics of living with virtue and holiness in the modern world, providing practical insights for men of all ages. You can hear The Catholic Gentleman, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates around the world, all in one place. All free at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click Podcast Central today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I was trying to thank Jason for that question last time. I could not find the name in front of me. So Jason, thank you for that question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's an open forum, but an internet open forum. All of our questions are in written form today, and this one comes from Matthew. Matthew asks this, Jimmy, what do you think of the view that death is not merely an instant, but a real event that lasts for some time, where Christ appears to everyone and offers them salvation, leaving them the choice of heaven or hell? Is this heretical or incompatible with the dogmatic constitution Benedictus Deus?
Okay, so I should first explain what Benedictus Deus is. It's a papal bull that was issued by Pope Benedict XII in the year 1336. And it's a response to Benedict's predecessor, Pope John the 22nd. Pope John the 22nd had a private opinion. He did not try to make this church teaching, but he had a private opinion that basically endorsed soul sleep, that said when you die, you don't really have conscious experiences until the last day. And so if you and this would have consequences for the communion of saints, because all those saints we're praying to up there, if they're not having conscious experiences, then what's happening with our prayers that we've been doing for 1,300 years? And so he got pushback and from high churchmen on this, and he ended up retracting his opinion and saying, okay, I guess departed saints and departed damned people do have conscious experiences of either bliss or torment prior to the resurrection of the dead. So soul sleep is false. And just to underscore that point, when his successor, Benedict XII, was elected, he decided, let's end all doubt on that matter and make it infallible. So he released the bull Benedictus Deus that makes it infallible. This is one of the very few papal exercises of infallibility on a doctrinal matter. There's only been something like, based on reasonable estimates, only something like 8 documents in the history of the church that have engaged papal infallibility. They've engaged it on more than 8 subjects, but there are only like 8 documents that do it, and this happens to be one of them. So it's infallibly defined that that souls do have conscious experiences between death and resurrection. What would that mean for Matthew's question of could death be a process? And as part of this process, could Christ appear to someone and give them like a last-minute chance to embrace his love and his grace? Well, we have evidence that death is a process because we've been able to reverse it beginning in the 20th century with things like cardiopulmonary stimulation. Before the mid-20th century, somebody's heart stopped. We couldn't do anything for them. They were dead. Well, now we can. And we've even been able to bring people back as late as 6 hours after the cessation of heart function. For that to happen, they need to have been cooled down very quickly to avoid brain damage. But there have been people who have frozen or fallen into a lake during winter and cooled down very rapidly. And we've been able to bring them back as much as 6 hours later.
Wow.
So with no brain damage. And so it seems like death does involve more of a process than we previously were aware. There's probably some instant where it becomes final, but it does look like there is a process of getting to that point where death becomes final, and we don't really know where that point is. Having said that, could Jesus appear to someone while they're in that dying process and give them a last-minute evangelization? Of course he could. He's omnipotent. He can do anything he chooses. And as long as they're not fully dead, as long as they're only mostly dead, because there's a big difference between fully dead and mostly dead.
Yeah.
As long as they're not fully dead, they could on some deep level respond and accept God's grace. And so this is not an impossible thing. God could through this or some other means, arrange for a kind of last-minute evangelization.
A nice quote from Miracle Max worked in
Yeah.
there.
Well,
Nicely
it's
done.
true. Really, if they're fully dead, the only thing you can do is go through their pockets looking for loose change.
But there was true love involved in that situation, I think. So
True love.
Miracle Max.
True love.
Marriage. Thank you, Matthew, very much for the question. It's an open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest, but it's an internet open forum, so I get to read the questions. And this one comes from Jerry.
Well, now you do.
Yes. Well, I have to be here.
Now that you
is a
showed
requirement.
up.
I couldn't. I can't. I'm not one of those bilocators who can do this and be stuck in traffic. Jerry asked this, Jimmy, I just saw something online where they were alleging that there was no historical evidence that Saint Juan Diego actually existed, that it was a total invention of the church authorities in Mexico, that John Paul II just went along and pushed his canonization. Is this true?
Okay, so the first thing is I'm going to note one of my pet peeves, and that is the expression "no evidence." This gets thrown around all the time by people, including on subjects where I actually agree with the people, where they'll say there's no evidence that this contrary view is true.
Yeah.
Well, that's almost always false. I can have some allowances for hyperbole, but it's almost always false.
Yeah.
There's usually something for any viewpoint that you could consider evidence, and people are just dismissing that frequently when they say there's no evidence. The question is usually not, is there no evidence? It's, is the evidence good? Well, okay, so this claim kind of got boosted in the 1990s prior to the canonization of Juan Diego by a gentleman named William Schulenberg, who was the abbot at the facility in Mexico City that holds the tilma. So he was like closely associated with Our Lady of Guadalupe. And he's like the head priest there, and he's saying Juan Diego never existed. Okay, well that got attention.
Yeah.
And it got attention at the Vatican. And before they canonized Juan Diego, they did a historical review of documents to verify, do we have good evidence that he really existed? And they concluded, yes, we do have good existence that Juan Diego really existed. That doesn't mean that every claim you hear about Juan Diego is accurate, but we do have evidence that he existed. And so the canonization proceeded. And there's a document that EWTN has in its library that deals with this, and I hope we can have a link to that in the show notes of this video.
Yeah, we can do that. Sure. Yeah. So okay, I have the link in front of me. We'll make sure that we get that on there. Yes. Okay, Jimmy?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm waiting for you to say something.
Oh, no. I'm done. We're going to put that in the show notes. Go ahead.
Good. That's all I had to say.
Oh, okay. I see. All right. I am so sorry. I thought that you were mid. I didn't realize we were at the conclusion. All right, Jerry, thanks very much. I appreciate that question. This one comes from Therese, who says, what does Romans 14:21 mean? It says, it is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble.
So Romans 14 is a really cool chapter, and it deals with a subject that Paul also deals with in 1 Corinthians, which is the way it's framed in 1 Corinthians, it's a little more explicit. Can you eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? And Paul says essentially the same thing in both places, that someone who is strong in their faith realizes that an idol is nothing, and so it doesn't matter if you eat meat that has been sacrificed to an idol, because that was frequently the only meat they had available. You know, if you're living in Corinth or in Rome, you go down to the butcher shop, the butcher probably sacrificed this animal to Apollo or something like that. So if you were going to avoid idol meat, you'd basically have to be a vegetarian. And in Romans 14, Paul says, receive people who are weak in faith, but don't get into arguments with them. And then he gives an example, and he says, one who's strong in his faith can eat anything, but one who's weak in faith eats only vegetables. So he's going the vegetarian route because he doesn't want to eat meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. But a person who's strong in their faith knows that an idol's nothing, so I can eat meat that was sacrificed to an idol. And Paul makes that point. Similarly, he can treat every day the same. He doesn't have to keep certain Jewish holy days as holy days, like Yom Kippur and things like that. And then, having made this point that a person who's strong in their faith is free in these ways, he then has a caution about using our freedom for good, because he says, but if somebody thinks it's wrong to eat this meat, and your example causes him to eat this meat so that he's violating his conscience, then that's a sin, and you're leading your brother into sin. You're scandalizing your brother. So if you want to eat the idol meat, that's fine. Feel free. But don't do it in front of a weak brother that you're going to tempt into what's for him is a sin.
Yeah.
Because it is a sin when we violate our conscience. There's nothing wrong with eating the idol meat, but if you think it's wrong and you do it anyway, then you're violating your conscience, and that's sinful. So don't scandalize people in the proper sense. Don't lead them into sin. Don't give these people an example that's going to cause them to violate their conscience. And that's what Romans 14:21 means. But I'd suggest reading it in the overall context of the chapter for more, and also checking out what Paul says on the same subject about idol meat in 1 Corinthians.
Thank you for the question, Therese. We appreciate that. You can probably hear the music. We got to take a quick break. But it will be a quick break, and then we'll be back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin. Lots of great questions to come, and I can actually say that for certain because I can read ahead and see the great questions to come. Hang on. More Jimmy Akin, Open Forum on Catholic Answers Live.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or at a good Catholic bookstore. Visit whywe'recatholic.com.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
What if the voice of your deepest doubts about Catholicism rose up in the form of a human being and challenged you to defend your most foundational beliefs? That's the task apologist Trent Horn took upon himself in his new book, Devil's Advocate, a dialogue with his own best objections against the faith that he professes and defends. You can stand up against your doubts, and Trent will show you how. Pick up your copy of Devil's Advocate today at shop.catholic.com or at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers Monthly Giving Club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. And as I said, lots of great questions to come. And this one I'm curious to see whether this is a yes or no question. So Mark asks, can you explain the Trinity in a basic way?
Yes, and you should know the answer to that side because you've heard me do it many times. So here we go. I'll hit the key combination and run the macro. A basic a,
Go ahead.
a basic explanation of the Trinity. So a basic understanding of the Trinity is God is one being who is three persons. So what's a being? Well, a being is anything that exists, anything that bees. So you are a being, Psychelet. I am a being. A rock is a being. A snowflake is a being. An angel is a being. God is a being. Anything that exists is a being. It bees. But you'll notice among the beings I just named, not all of them are persons. Rocks and snowflakes are beings, but a rock is 0 persons, and a snowflake is 0 persons. Whereas you and I, or an angel, we're each one person. Psychelet is one person, Jimmy Akin is one person, Bob the Archangel is one person. So some beings are 0 persons, some beings are one person. But if that's true, then it shows us that being and person are fundamentally different categories. And so if some beings are less than one person and some beings are exactly one person, then it's logically possible for some beings to be more than one person. And that's what God is. God is one being who is 3 persons. So the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. Those are the 3 persons of the Trinity. And there's no logical contradiction here. So that's a basic, simple explanation of the Trinity.
Mark, thank you for the question. And Jimmy, I call him Robert because he's an archangel. But
No, well,
you're very
you may
casual.
not be on as familiar terms
I'm not
with
as
him.
familiar with Bob the Archangel. All right. Anybody want to tell me how to pronounce that first name? I know I'm not going to get it right. How would you do it, Jim?
This would be a guess, but I would guess Jate.
Oh, okay. That's basically where I was going to go.
Could be Yate. It could be Hate.
Right.
In fact, it looks like one of the surnames is maybe Hispanic, so maybe Hate.
Okay. What's the morality of sharing a PDF that's copyrighted? Does it involve grave matter?
Well, it depends on what's in the PDF. If it contains the U.S. nuclear codes to launch nuclear missiles and you start sharing that around, yes, that involves grave matter. But if it's, something that's public domain that was copyrighted but is no longer copyrighted, well, that's obviously not grave matter. It's not a sin at all to share that if it's in the public domain. So what we see here is it's like any other form of sharing property without the permission of the owner. There's a spectrum. And yeah, you can have grave matter involved, but for that, it has to do some kind of grave damage to the owner. And most of the time, if you're sharing a PDF, it's not going to do grave damage to the owner. And so, if you think about it, like if you shared a book, that someone had, is that going to do grave damage to the owner most of the time? No. And sharing a PDF is going to potentially, it can, let's say someone has this hot novel that they've written that's going to make them $1 million. And before they can get it published, you share it and it goes viral and kills the market for the book.
Yeah.
So they don't make $1 million. Well, that would be grave matter, but that's a very rare circumstance. So almost always, in just sharing a PDF, it's not going to be grave damage, and therefore it's not going to be grave matter. It's not going to be a mortal sin. At most, it would be venial. And there are some situations where it's reasonable to share property without the consent of the owner, and it's not sinful at all. So you have to look at what's reasonable and, what's reasonable to do in this situation. And you want to compensate the owner if possible, but it's not an absolute mandate. And there can be situations of fair use, whether they're recognized by the law or not, which simply don't even involve sin in this area. So there's a spectrum.
All right. Hate. Thank you very much for the question. This one comes from Samantha. Why is it permissible to divide the bodies of saints, but not permissible for people to divide cremains of a loved one?
Well, it actually is possible to divide cremains of a loved one. This is something that was recently confirmed by a decree from the that's the old name for it, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith over in Rome at the end of 2023. So this has just recently been confirmed. There are situations where you can, for example, divide the cremains of a loved one and put some of them in a common repository where they're mixed with the cremains of other people. And you can also put a portion of the cremains in a place, provided it's a sacred place, that was meaningful to the person during their life. So maybe their home parish or something. What the church doesn't want is scattering them and just losing track of them. They want, if you do divide the cremains, they want the person's name preserved so that there will be a memory of, like when you go to the common repository of cremains, it's got the names of all the people who were in there. So that way you can pray for them. Their memory is not forgotten. Whereas if you just go out into the woods and start throwing ashes around, there's no record of who was here or that there even was anybody whose ashes are scattered here. There's no marker there to tell people this is a place that human remains are put, and here's the person, and so now you can pray for the person while you're here. There's nothing like that in those cases. And so they similarly, you dump them in the sea or throw them out of an airplane, they just go everywhere. And there's no marker, there's no record of the person's identity. So so that's why the church doesn't want them just scattered. But notice you can't do that with saint remains either. You know, if you got the body of the relics of a saint, you don't just go throw them out of an airplane.
Yeah.
The church wants the memory of our departed to be preserved, in part so that we can pray for them when we visit their graves, and so they can pray for us also.
Samantha, thank you very much for that question. This one is not a question, it's a command, and it comes from Gracie. Discuss gossip in relation to envy.
Okay, so envy is a situation that arises when one person has something that another person desires. Sometimes there will be a distinction drawn between envy and jealousy, where envy is like a resentment of what someone else has, whereas jealousy will be more of a focus on what I have and not wanting anyone else to take that away. But there's a lot of overlap between these two terms. They can be used in other ways as well. But envy, well, let's just stick with the idea of envy is looking at what someone else has and wishing one had it and resenting the fact that they have it. Like right now, Cy Kellett's wearing a fleece-lined army green jacket.
Yes.
Suppose for some reason, now I have jackets I'm perfectly happy with, but for purposes of this example, suppose I wished I had Cy Kellett's fleece-lined army green jacket, and frankly, it's not my color, but suppose I wished I had it and I resented him for having it. Okay, well, that could drive me to gossip. Gossip is the sharing of information.
Yeah.
Usually, frequently, it's of trivial nature, but it can be more serious. And if I'm envious of Cy because of his jacket, I might gossip about Cy and run Cy down and say bad things about him, like, "Oh, he's not worthy of that jacket." I mean, what a schlemiel, Cy Kellett is. What a schlemazel he is. I mean,
Laverne and Shirley.
Hassenpfeff Incorporated, this is ridiculous that he's got a jacket like that. He totally doesn't deserve it. So gossip can be driven by envy. However, it's not always. A lot of times gossip is just, or what can be considered gossip is driven by curiosity, which is not envy. It's like, did you know this about this person? It's driven by curiosity a lot. So I don't think we can ascribe any one motive to gossip. And frankly, a lot of gossip, I mean, if it's negative gossip, where you're harming someone's reputation, well, you don't want to do that without a good reason. That's detraction. But sometimes there is a good reason, to let other people know. Like let's say I know a guy named Bob. This one is not an archangel.
Okay.
And he's starting a relationship with a young woman. Let's call her Alice. And I might know that, actually Bob is secretly married to a woman named Carol. And I might, I might tell Ted, Bob is actually married to Carol, but he's trying to put the moves on Alice.
Yeah.
Ted, could you let Alice know about this fact about Bob that's important for her to know? And Ted might do that. So, so there can be reasons to share information. And a lot of gossip is, it's kind of driven by our primate instincts to just share information about what's going on in the community so we're all up to date.
Yeah, right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. We don't need to be overly scrupulous as long as we're not damaging other people's reputations and their ability to navigate socially.
Gracie, thank you for that command. It's so funny when you make a reference like that, and I can see that the guys in the booth have no idea what you're talking about, but that I'm laughing. And you've never heard of Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice? Any of you? No?
Yeah.
They're just too young. They haven't.
Yeah.
They weren't exposed to the bad media.
You live longer, you know more.
Yes. Let's see. No, I better take a break. Let's take a quick break. I'll explain Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice to the guys in the booth, and we'll be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin right after this.
Catholic Answers Live.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
One of the reasons we should go to Mass is because, if you look in the Catechism, you will see the fruits of Holy Communion. And these are remarkable things that we can receive at every Mass that we attend. We encounter the risen Lord, and He shares something of His divine life and love with us.
The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, live from the EWTN Chapel, every morning, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and Television.
Welcome back, Catholic Answers Live. Got to be on your toes. Jimmy's thrown in the movie references today. We've got a couple movie references already, and he throws them in there subtly, and I laugh, and the guys in the booth just look at me like, "What are you laughing about?"
I like to throw in subtle humor. It's like if you know it, it's there for you, and you can laugh at it. But I'm not making a big production of.
Yeah.
But bump. Look at the joke I just told.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, I do feel people are envious of this jacket. Like, this is such... Darren says yes, he is. I don't know about Andrew, but this is...
Well, it's not my color, so I at least there's one person who's not envious of your jacket.
All right, Mark asked this question. How...
And if I were, I'd just buy my own. I wouldn't run you down.
Well, that's right. Yes, I know. Even if you were envious, I don't believe you would run me down. I don't think you're...
I try not to.
No. Mark wants to know this. How sure are you that the Bible is, and that's in capital letters, the Word of God?
Well, since we're using capital letters, very sure.
All right. You spoke in capital letters.
Yeah. I mean, I have the lines of evidence that support the Bible being the Word of God are multiple. And there's a lot of good evidence for the reliability, for example, of the New Testament, and in terms of historical matters. But then there's also evidence for the reliability of the New Testament in recording supernatural matters like the resurrection of Christ. We've actually got really good evidence he rose from the dead. And so and there are other things like fulfilled prophecies and so forth. And all of that leads to a reasonability of accepting the Bible's own claim that it's the Word of God, because various passages in Scripture indicate that that God interacts with mankind and that He influences the writing of selected texts, including those in the Bible. And so we have what are sometimes called in apologetics motives of credibility that lend credibility to the Bible as the Word of God. And I am personally convinced that that's the case. Now, that is a basic claim. It doesn't tell us everything that we would want to know. Like, so what does it mean to be the Word of God? Exactly what are the limits? How does the divine element in Scripture interact with the human element? So there's still lots of questions to be answered, but on the basic question of, is the Bible the Word of God? Yeah, I'm quite confident of that.
Mark, thank you very much for the question. Here's one from Ryan, and I've actually been looking forward to your answer to this, Jimmy. What can we say about Jesus' education? Can we infer at all about which rabbis or rabbinic schools he may have studied under, and or which languages besides Aramaic he was fluent in?
So we can't infer a huge amount about Jesus's education. Sometimes there is a tendency to retroject modern Hebrew education onto the past. Like here in America, a lot of kids go to public school, but if they're Jewish kids, their parents want them to have knowledge of their Jewish heritage, and so frequently they're also sent to Hebrew school. In addition to public school or private school, they're also sent, to a uniquely sectarian Hebrew school, like on weekends or nights or things like that, to learn Hebrew, for example. And so that's kind of, that modern practice has kind of led to a myth that this was normal in antiquity. And all Jewish boys were shipped off to Hebrew school so they could learn to read and write Hebrew and read the scriptures. And thus they had high literacy rates in Jewish society. No, this did not happen, not this way. Jewish people in the first century were not any more literate than anybody else. And that's to say they weren't very literate. Something like 10 to 20% of people were functionally literate in the city, maybe. A lot of people could write their name and that's it. But the overwhelming majority of people, including in Jewish society, did not know how to read and write. So we can't just make assumptions about Jesus and his education based on what Jewish education was like in general, because what most Jewish education was like is you go to work with your dad or you get apprenticed to someone else and you learn a trade and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
But we know Jesus was literate because Luke tells us he was literate. He goes to the synagogue and is in Luke and is handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and reads a passage out loud from it. So that tells us Jesus was literate. So somehow he learned to read. Unlike most of the people around him, he did know how to read. But he grew up in Nazareth. And Nazareth is not the place where the famous rabbis were hanging out. Rabbis like Gamaliel and people like that, they were down in Jerusalem. So Jesus may have met various rabbis whose names are known to us from the Mishnah, the Jewish writing of the 2nd century that kind of codified Pharisaic opinions of this period. It mentions a bunch of rabbis. Jesus may have met some of those guys, but we don't have good evidence that he studied under any of them because he's living in Nazareth, not Jerusalem. So we don't really know a lot about his language. We do know, since Ryan asked, that he was, fluent in Aramaic, and the Gospels use Aramaic words and put them on the lips of Jesus. So we know he spoke Aramaic. It is possible that he also knew Hebrew, but that's in his human intellect. He obviously knew everything in his divine intellect, but it's possible he knew Hebrew in his human intellect. It's also possible he knew Greek to some degree in his human intellect, because it was the kind of the international language of the time. It was the lingua franca of the time, kind of like English is now. I love how English is the new French language. Yeah. So he may have had knowledge of Greek as well. There have been books written discussing, did he know Greek? But that's speculative at this point. We really don't know what languages he spoke for certain, other than Aramaic.
Ryan, thank you very much for those questions. We go on. More questions. It's open forum. It's an internet open forum, and this one comes from Claire. I'm not questioning the Trinity. But
Good.
There you go, Claire. Good start. But I have a question about the way that it is expressed in the prayer of the collect. Almighty living God who govern, multiple rather than saying who governs, as in one God.
Yeah, so this is something that we have in English where our verbs get inflected or change form based on whether the subject of the verb is singular or plural. Like, to give an obvious example, I might say, I am going to the mall, or I might say, we are going to the mall. And even if I didn't say I or we, you could still tell what I meant if I just said, I'm going to the mall, or are going to the mall. You could infer there's the subject of those verbs must be singular if it's am and plural if it's are.
Right.
Well, we also do the same thing with verbs like govern. He governs. So there's a singular verb subject there, but they, so he governs with an S, but they govern. No S, indicating a plural subject. And so if you say, Almighty and ever-living God who govern, that seems to be a mismatch, because Almighty and ever-living God is a singular subject, but it's a plural verb. Okay, so whenever you get something weird looking in a translation, what you want to do is look up the original and see what it says. And what it says in Latin for this prayer is omnipotens sempiterne Deus, qui celestia simul et terrena moderaris. So omnipotens sempiterne Deus, that would mean Almighty, ever-living God, basically. That's a singular subject. Qui celestia simul et terrena, so who heaven at the same time as earth, moderaris. Okay, moderaris is a plural verb, and it is present tense, so who moderates, but it is a plural verb, and that doesn't seem to match with the singular subject God. What might it match with? Well, there's a complicating factor in that moderaris is what's known in Latin as a deponent verb. A deponent verb is one that looks passive, but can function actively. So like an active verb is like, I hit Cy. A passive verb would be, I was hit by Cy. Okay. So a deponent verb is one that looks passive. It's like you're saying, I was hit by Cy, but it actually means I hit Cy.
Okay.
And that's how a deponent verb can function. So I haven't done a huge amount of sentence diagramming here, but it seems to me there is something plural here. And that's celestia simul et terrena, heaven simultaneously with earth. That's plural. And so I suspect, and like I said, I'd have to think about this more, but I suspect that in this case, the deponent verb, which is being translated govern, which is plural in English, actually may be functioning passively here. Who heaven and earth are governed by. And with heaven and earth, that gets you the plural, are governed by. But in any event, I agree it's an infelicitous English translation, and I understand why it causes confusion.
I hope that helps, Claire. I appreciate the call, not the call, but you sending in the question. Hey, it's an open forum, but it's the internet open forum. All the questions coming from the internet, and we've got another hour of it. Jimmy Akin is our guest. I am Cy Kellett, your host and reader for today. I will be reading the questions for the next hour, and I can promise you this, a lot of really good questions.
You're a lector for the show.
I'm the lector, that's right. I'm the designated lector for the show. And I'll be doing more lecturing right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kelly, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we continue, as promised, with Open Forum, Internet Open Forum, for Jimmy Akin. All of these questions came for Jimmy via the Internet, and we gathered them up and brought them in here, and I'm going to read them, and Jimmy's going to answer them. And I was just reading you one before we went from Claire, that Almighty Living, she was talking about the collect, one of the collects of the Mass, Almighty Living God who governs. She didn't like the use of the multiple, or, the plural verb with the singular noun.
Subject.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were...
Yeah, and I had a memory slip.
Oh, okay.
As I was giving the answer, so I wanted to revisit it. The key verb in Latin for this is moderaris, which it's cognate with moderate in English, but govern is fine. And I had said my memory slip was that moderaris is plural. It's not. It's singular. And that of itself clears up the entire thing, because it's omnipotens sempiterne Deus, omnipotent and ever-living God, qui, who, moderaris, who governs. And so if it's translated in English as who govern, that's simply a mistake in the English translation. It is a singular verb in the Latin matching with the singular subject, Almighty and ever-living God.
Claire, I say you take this to the competent authorities and report this. Thank you, Claire. An error. We've got ourselves an error. Jimmy Mark wants to know this one.
Okay.
Why do you think Jesus wasn't more straightforward and left no argument on who he is? God.
I think there are several reasons for this. One of them is he didn't want to cause a problem too soon. He wanted to be able to conduct his ministry. He wanted to be able to heal people. He wanted to be able to preach the gospel. He wanted to be able to travel around. And if right out the gate he started claiming to be God, they would have done to him at the beginning what they did to him at the end. Because there was an idea in Judaism at the time that was shared by some Jews that in addition to Yahweh, God in heaven, there's also a second power in heaven who sometimes was called the second Yahweh or the lesser Yahweh. And this figure was identified with the Son of Man in Daniel 7, where Daniel sees this vision of heaven. He sees the Ancient of Days, meaning God seated on a throne, and he sees other heavenly beings seated on thrones. And then up to the Ancient of Days comes one like a Son of Man riding on a cloud. And riding on a cloud is divine imagery. The Old Testament talks about how Yahweh rides on clouds. And so this other figure who's then given dominion over the entire earth rides up to the Father or rides up to God on a cloud and is given this everlasting dominion over everything. And he's this heavenly being. And so that to many Jews that's the lesser Yahweh. That's the second Yahweh. It's another divine power in heaven, comparable only to God himself. And but this two powers in heaven doctrine, as it's now called, was not received by everybody. You had other people who thought, no, there's just one power in heaven. It's not more than one. And so then if you look in Mark 14, when Jesus is on trial before the high priest, they're trying him and they're having trouble getting a charge they can use to condemn him, because just claiming to be the Messiah, they expected a Messiah. There's nothing wrong with claiming to be the Messiah. The question is, are you though? And so the high priest, since they're having trouble getting a charge to attack Jesus on or to condemn him on, the high priest says, tell us plainly, are you the Son of the Blessed or not? And Jesus says, I am, and henceforth, meaning from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he's referring to Daniel saying, I'm that guy in that vision. I'm the second Yahweh. And at that point, the high priest tears his clothes and says, you've heard the blasphemy, let's do him in. And similarly, in John's gospel, Jesus earlier talked about how he's the Son of God, making himself equal with the Father, and that led to a near lynching attempt. So one of the reasons was that Jesus didn't talk about this more clearly and more openly and more regularly is because he didn't want more lynching attempts. He wanted to be able to go conduct his ministry until the time was right for him to go to the cross. So that's one reason he wasn't clearer about it. Another reason, or another factor to consider here, is that he did make it clear to those he was close to. He gave them, not necessarily from the beginning, but he gave them enough information that they would realize who he was, as the gospel authors clearly do realize that Jesus is God and portray him that way. I also think there's a third reason, and that's that if he just came out and regularly said, "I am God," it would cause confusion, because in the Jewish mind, the term God was largely tied to the Father. And so if he said, particularly for Jews who did not have the two powers in heaven doctrine, they think of God as, there's just the one God, and that's who Jesus speaks of as the Father. And so if he said, "I'm God," it could mislead people into thinking Jesus is saying he's the Father.
Yeah.
And he's not the Father, he's the Son.
Yeah.
So since the term God was so exclusively associated in many minds with the Father, he's not going to just easily say, "I am God," without further clarification, because that would make people think he's claiming to be the Father, which is actually a heresy. That's the heresy of modalism or patripassianism. So he took it slow. He let the needed people know stuff, but he didn't get really clear about it until right before the end in front of the authorities when it was time for him to go to the cross.
Mark, thank you. Appreciate the question. It's open forum. This one comes from Anastasio. Is there another meaning of baptism other than immersion?
Yeah, so the Greek verb baptizo can mean several different things. It can mean immerse. It can also mean dip, and it can mean wash, among other things. There are other meanings of the word that are even farther afield. The question is, what did it mean in a Christian context? And what did it always mean to immerse in a Christian context, so that you had to immerse someone in order to baptize them? Or could it mean other things, like just wash, where you don't have to immerse someone in order to baptize them? Well, we know the answer to this because it's found not in the New Testament, but in another Christian document that dates from the 1st century. The document is known as the Didache, or sometimes called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. That's what Didache means, is teaching. And in the Didache, it has a discussion of how you baptize people. And it says, well, if you have living water, by which they meant running water, baptize them in the running water. You got a stream or something, baptize them in the stream. If you don't have living water, then but you do have standing water, then baptize them in the standing water. So you got a pool of water. It's not running, but it's a pool of water. You can baptize them in that. Doesn't tell us how you do that, though. Doesn't tell us, are you dunking them? Are you immersing them? Or are you doing something else? But the third thing it says does tell us about the mode of baptism, because it says if you don't have living water or standing water, pour water on their head 3 times. So right here in the 1st century, we have pouring as a legitimate, or what's sometimes called infusion, as a legitimate mode of baptism in the Christian community. So the term baptizo or baptizo, depending on how you want to pronounce it, it had a range of meanings, but we know that in the Christian community, in the sacramental context, it did have a semantic range that included pouring.
All right. Anastasio, thank you. We got to take a break. More to come. Open forum today, internet open forum. Lots more great questions right after this for Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Bringing you the truth. Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
What a great grace it is to have the opportunity to use the airwaves for the honor and glory of God, to be able to talk to the hearts of individuals and meet them where they are in their relationship with our Lord, and also to encourage them forward.
Women of Grace with Jonette Williams. This morning, 3 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's an open forum today, and Jimmy Akin is our guest. Jimmy, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, a very popular part of the internet that many people have become fans of. Probably, all right, I always forget how many, but I think you're probably coming up on like several hundred. I know that we don't know exactly when this episodes. Like you've got hundreds of episodes now, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We already have. By the time this Evergreen show goes live, we're already going to have more than 300 numbered episodes, in addition to bonus episodes that aren't part of the regular numbering system.
Yeah, I said one time that you had more episodes than the Carol Burnett show.
We do. Yeah, Carol Burnett topped out around between 270 and 290. So we passed her a while back.
Yeah. So you can check it out at, we'll just put Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. If you put probably Mysterious World, Jimmy Akin, whatever, into your...
Or mysterious.fm.
Or just go to mysterious.fm and find out what everyone is enjoying so much at Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. But we've got Jimmy here for an open forum this hour, and this one comes from Matt. Jimmy, who is Father Malachi Martin? And is there any legitimacy to his prophetic claims, the end of the pontificate, I think, after the 112th Pope, or the extension of the third secret of Fatima, which I remember you mentioned in one of your episodes on Fatima, or his covert description of the church and certain bishops in a windswept house. I know it's a lot, but as a priest, I'm often struggling with trying to help parishioners in the more traditional movements concerning this subject.
So I think there may be some confusion going on here between Father Malachi Martin and the prophecy of the popes, which was attributed to Saint Malachi. Saint Malachi is a different guy. He lived in the Middle Ages in Ireland. And he also his name is also spelled a little differently. It's Malachi with a Y rather than Malachi with an I. And Saint Malachi is credited with this thing called the prophecy of the popes, which is basically a list of descriptors of different popes that are ostensibly a prophecy from Saint Malachi's time in the Middle Ages through kind of now, because if you assume every, there are no gaps, and these guys are all so-and-so is the successor of so-and-so in the papacy, we're basically out of popes and on the list. And the last one on the list is supposed to be a guy named Peter the Roman. Now, there's some doubt about, is there a gap in the list, like towards the end of it? It's not 100% clear. So it's possible that there's a skip where you go through the end of the prophecy of the popes, and then there's a skip to the very last one, Peter the Roman. But we have to, like with any claim of a prophecy, we have to say, okay, what's the evidence for this? What is this a genuine prophecy or not? And we always start in any paranormal or supernatural investigation with the natural hypothesis that the explanation for this is natural, unless we can discount all of the natural causes that could explain it. So what are the natural causes that could explain something like this? Well, chance is one of them. It could be that these descriptions of the popes, now they don't contain their names typically. Peter the Roman is an exception. It uses the name Peter. But most of them say things like glory of the olive or labor of the sun or something. And so you kind of got to match the name to something about the descriptor, to something about the Pope other than his name. And so could this just be due to random chance? You know, the successes on this list. Well, that raises the question of how many successes are there? How many of these descriptors seem to be plausibly linked to the particular Pope that they ought to link with? Well, I've done a study of that. And it's at my website, jimmyakin.com. So if you search for Prophecy of St. Malachi and Jimmy Akin, this will come up. There's a shorter summary, and then there's a longer treatment where I go through every single one of the prophecies, all like 100 plus of them. And I assign them to one of three categories: hit, miss, or vague. It's a hit. One of these entries is considered a hit if there is an obvious correspondence between the description and some notable fact about the Pope's life, something that's fairly obvious to see. It's a miss if there is no obvious connection to the Pope in question. And it's vague if it doesn't clearly fall in either one of those two categories. So what I found when I went through the prophecy of the popes is you have a remarkable string of hits all the way down from St. Malachi's time to the time of Urban V in 1590. There are no clear misses in that time frame. There are only a handful of vague ones. The overwhelming majority of the descriptors between St. Malachi and 1590 are hits. And then everything changes. After 1590, misses predominate. There are basically no hits, and there are a few vague possible maybes in that time frame after 1590. So what we see is a radical change in the hit rate of these prophecies. Down to 1590, they are, with very few exceptions, dead on. After 1590, they are, with very few exceptions, dead off. And that suggests another natural explanation, not random chance. Random chance is probably the explanation for things after 1590. But the overall explanation for this list is fraud. In fact, what we're looking at, the evidence would suggest, is a vaticinium ex eventu, or a prophecy made after the fact for the popes before 1590. What almost certainly happened in this case is someone around the year 1590 decided they wanted to come up with this prophecy of the popes document, presumably as a way of maybe just for yucks, just because they wanted to have fun, but possibly also because they wanted to influence a papal conclave. Because Urban V just reigned very shortly, and they were going to have a new conclave. And if you have this prophecy that supports this other candidate, and you could get your guy elected Pope, and if you've got a prophecy supporting his election, but it shouldn't just end now. So we'll tack on some extra names. So it looks like, and we'll attribute it to this guy that lived hundreds of years ago in Ireland, St. Malachi. So and then we'll salt it into some records at the Vatican, and we can discover it right before the conclave. And hey, it seems to be pointing to we ought to vote for this guy. So it's possible that it was a forgery that was intended to influence a papal election, or it could be something else. But one way or another, it looks like whoever wrote this document was not St. Malachi. It was someone living in around 1590. They looked at a list of prior popes and made up accurate descriptions for them. But going forward, they didn't have any supernaturally knowledge of future popes, and that's why the hit rate plummets spectacularly at 1590, and any possible correspondences after that seem to be just random chance. So it looks like this is not an actual prophecy from St. Malachi. This is a forgery. The first half of it, pre-1590, is Vaticinium ex eventu. The latter half of it is just random chance. But it doesn't look like this is an accurate prophecy at all, and so I would not give it any credit at all. And if you want to read more about that, Father Matt, just Google Jimmy Akin, Prophecy of St. Malachi with a Y. Now, when it comes to Malachi Martin, he was a guy that lived in the 20th century. He was from Ireland, and he became a priest and a Jesuit. And then he wasn't. He left the Jesuit order, possibly kind of under a cloud. He also, there are different stories about, was he laicized or did he still have permission to celebrate the sacraments? And there's some dispute about that. I have not done the research I would want to do yet to settle that question. I may well do an episode of Malachi Martin in the future on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, but I haven't yet been able to sort out all of these questions. But he left the active priesthood. He claimed to still have permission to celebrate the sacraments. He was no longer a Jesuit. He started writing books, and his books changed over time. He wrote like a history of the Jesuits. He wrote some other things in the 1970s. And when you read his stuff from the 1970s, he's coming off like a liberal. And then he starts writing books about exorcism and about conspiracy theories involving John Paul II and skullduggery at the Vatican. Windswept House is a novel that he wrote allegedly based on a kind of treatment center for priests that had been, committing abuse. And so he has this kind of pivot. He has several pivots. I mean, first he's a priest. He's even an associate of Cardinal Bea during the Second Vatican Council. Then after the council, he's writing like a progressive, and then he pivots and becomes a conservative. What it really looks like is he's an opportunist. That his message changed based on what he could get clicks for at the time. In the 1970s, I mean, they didn't have clicks back then, but in the 1970s, the progressive theology was trendy. And then the exorcism and conspiracies about liberal skullduggery, that's trendy, and he shifted. So it looks like he's kind of a theological opportunist. When it comes to something like Windswept House, well, okay, I have no problem believing there are treatment centers, for priests who have had problems to go and recuperate and take a sabbatical and maybe get psychological treatment and things like that. So he very well could have heard rumors about such a facility and written Windswept House, but it's a work of fiction that's based on rumor. So don't take anything it says super seriously, because it's not going to be super accurate. It's imaginative fiction to begin with, and the factual basis is rumor-based. So there's going to be lots of distortions, and as an author, he's unconstrained by needing to keep things close to reality. He can make up something and put it in the story just because it's more dramatic to propose this happened rather than what we actually have evidence happened. So I am afraid I view Malachi Martin with a lot of suspicion and don't consider him a particularly reliable individual in any of the phases of his career, whether it was when he was a priest or after he was a priest when he was a progressive, or after he was a progressive when he was a conservative. I don't really have a lot of confidence in this guy one way or another.
Thank you very much, Matt. I hope that was helpful to you. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to read the next one, Jimmy. I don't know. There may not. Well, we'll see how we do on time.
Read it, and we'll see how we do.
Hello, Jimmy. When God created Adam and Eve, how old were they? Thank you, and God bless.
Well, if we assume that the text is literal, so that they were created, not born, then, well, they clearly weren't babies, because babies cannot take care of themselves. So they had to be old enough to take care of themselves, at least in a paradisical environment where there aren't a lot of struggles. So they would, I would say they'd minimum, they'd need to be older children. But since they're told to be fruitful and multiply, if they're meant to start doing that anytime soon, I would assume they're also of reproductive age at the time they began. There has been some speculation that 33 is the ideal human age, in part influenced by that's how old Christ was. And so there have been people who speculated they were physically 33, and that's possible, but ultimately we don't know, and that's even taking this text literally.
Mark, thanks for that question. Right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers Monthly Giving Club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Is relativism dead? It sure seems dead. Each day, new moral demands are made, and they are presented to us as absolutes. Everything, from transgender ideology to physician-assisted suicide, is presented as a moral good that all right-thinking people must accept. But Catholic Answers' own Carlo Broussard says look deeper, and you will see today's moralism is just relativism dressed up in new clothes. Carlo's eye-opening book, The New Relativism, shines a light on how the sacred moral teachings of this age cover up a deep denial of moral truth. Order your copy of The New Relativism today at shop.catholic.com and be prepared to defend the truth against aggressive relativism. The New Relativism at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thank you so much for being here with us. Jimmy Akin is here with us, and it's open forum, and all the questions have already been submitted. It's an internet open forum. And Brett says this: I've been keeping a list because I always forget my questions when you ask. Here are two. All right, the first one is this: are there any extra biblical writings that we possess which we are fairly sure were written by people who knew or interacted with Jesus or who are mentioned in the Bible?
There are no extra biblical writings that we have that we are at all confident were written by people who knew or interacted with Jesus. The only writings that fit that description are in the Bible themselves. Like, for example, the Gospel of John is clearly written by an eyewitness, someone who knew Jesus. It's written by the beloved disciple. You can debate exactly who the beloved disciple was. Was it John, son of Zebedee, or was it someone else? But it's clearly written by someone who knew and interacted with Jesus. And the same is true for, at least appears to be true, for Matthew's Gospel and for the letter of James and the letters of John and the two letters of Peter. Beyond that, it was people who, so far as we know, didn't interact with Jesus personally, but were kind of one step removed from Jesus. They were either they were associates of people who did know Jesus. When it comes to, are there documents that were written by people who are mentioned in the Bible? Well, okay, sure. I mean, we've got like stuff that Augustus Caesar wrote. and stuff that Tiberius Caesar wrote. So we have stuff like that. But I assume you mean something that was written within the Christian community, Christians who are mentioned in the Bible. And the answer to that is maybe. One document that seems to have been written or begun to be written about the year 80, so about 10 years after the destruction of the Jewish temple, is known as the Shepherd. And it's attributed to a guy named Hermas, who's named in the document itself. So it's also called the Shepherd of Hermas. And Hermas, according to at least a couple of early Christian writers, early church fathers, is the Hermas that's mentioned by Paul in Romans 15. So Romans is written about the year AD 54. And Paul mentions, as he's greeting all these people, he's never been to Rome, but he knows the names of a lot of people in Rome. And I assume the reason he knew their names, that he knew how to greet all these people he'd never met, is because he was using a scribe from Rome to write the letter, Tertius. And Tertius is already known to the Romans, and at one point he salutes the Romans himself and says, "I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, salute you." And so the Romans knew who Tertius was. And my guess is the reason that Paul wrote Romans is because he's here in Corinth, he's planning to go to the Holy Land next, but then he wants to go to Rome on his way to Spain. And lo and behold, while he's in Corinth and preparing to go back to the Holy Land, this Roman dude, Tertius, shows up, and he's a scribe. He knows how to write. So, okay, Tertius, I want to write a letter to Rome, and I want to say howdy to all the churches in Rome. So let's go through your memory of the different house churches in Rome and the names of the people in them, and I'll greet every one of them in chapter 15. Which is what he then does. And you can even tell the structure by looking at the groupings of names. You can tell these people are going to this church and these people are going to this other church and stuff like that. So you get a little map of what the Roman church is like in AD 54. And one of the people who's listed is this guy named Hermas. Well, then we have another guy from Rome named Hermas about 80. So this is like, 20-something years later, writing this book, The Shepherd. And according to various early church writers, not a huge number, but according to a few, that's the Hermas from Romans. So it's quite possible that The Shepherd of Hermas is a book written by someone, a Christian, who's mentioned in the Bible. There's another book that's attributed to, First Clement. Clement of Rome is mentioned apparently in like Philippians, and we have the letter to the Corinthians that Clement wrote on behalf of the Roman clergy. So it looks like that's another one from someone who's mentioned in the New Testament, a Christian who's mentioned in the New Testament. And then there's another work that's attributed to Barnabas. Barnabas is mentioned in the book of Acts, in a few of Paul's epistles, but he was he was another apostle. He was an associate of Paul. Luke refers to Paul and Barnabas both together as apostles, so Barnabas is included in that. And we have this letter known as the letter of Barnabas that is in the early church commonly attributed to Barnabas. Now, a lot of modern scholars reject that claim and say this is not really by Barnabas, but I want to know how they know that. Modern scholarship has been entirely too skeptical of traditional authorship attributions, and so I have yet to study the matter. And I could, upon studying it, conclude, yeah, this isn't really by Barnabas. We don't know who wrote it. But I think we need to be open to the idea that it may have been written by Barnabas, and I want to see arguments to overcome the presumption that it was written by Barnabas, given that's how it's attributed in the early church. At this point, I don't see any reason why Barnabas couldn't have written it. But I, as I said, need to study the evidence further.
Okay, so that was the first question from Brett. And Brett, thank you very much for that question. Here's his second question. What programs or books Or where for classes would you suggest for someone to learn biblical Greek, Latin, or Hebrew? If you ever consider writing an academic commentary or any of the books of the Bible, please do so. I'll gladly buy 2 or 3.
Yeah, well, I've written not academic commentaries, but sort of mid-level commentaries on some of the books of the New Testament. I'd like to write them all eventually, on each book of the New Testament. So far, only Mark has come out, but that's available on Logos Bible software. When it comes to language learning resources, you mentioned Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and I'd have different answers for each one. So I'll tell you what I studied, and then I'll give you my thoughts on it. For Greek, I began with the Basics of Biblical Greek by Bill Mounts, and I really liked it. It has a lot of really good features. It's very innovative. You start reading biblical text from the first, or from the beginning of the book. You're actually reading part of the Bible, which is a big motivator as opposed to just reading made-up sentences in Greek. And it teaches you the vocabulary in focusing on the most frequent words. So the words that you're learning are the ones that are most useful to you. It's not just teaching you obscure words to be complete. It's teaching you, here are the most common words in the New Testament. Let's learn some of them. Mm-hmm. And so that's really good. And there's a kind of a sequence that develops from Basics of Biblical Greek. There are some associated books, that some of which were also written by William Mounts. There's also a higher level book written by Daniel Wallace called Biblical Greek Beyond the Basics, which is a more advanced grammar. And there are a bunch of handy resources like books of readings and stuff like that to help you practice. When it came to Latin, I learned from Collins's Latin grammar, and I as part of private tutoring, and I hated it. I absolutely hated Collins's Latin grammar. I thought it was, I forget, it's called something like a primer on ecclesiastical Latin, but I hated it. It has loads of made-up examples, and it teaches in a way that I did not find congenial at all. When it comes to Hebrew, there is a Basics of Biblical Hebrew course that's put out by the same publisher and uses a similar methodology to Mounts's Basics of Biblical Greek. Also, since Hebrew is a revived language, it hasn't changed a whole lot, not grammatically and not vocabulary-wise, over the last 2,000 years. It kind of got frozen in time and was used only by specialists, and then became popular again in connection with the founding of the State of Israel. So you can actually learn modern Hebrew, and it'll give you a lot of biblical Hebrew at the same time. It's not like you can't learn modern Greek, and that's not going to give you a huge amount of ability to read the Greek New Testament. It'll give you some, but not a huge amount. Whereas Hebrew, the language hasn't changed as much because it was kind of in the deep freeze for a long time. So I actually like the program sequence for Hebrew put out by Pimsleur, Pimsleur. It's an audio program where you listen to native speakers and repeat what they say, and then it puts the burden on you based on what you've learned. Okay, you learned how to say this to a man. You learned how to say, how to modify things to say it to a woman. Now tell us, how would you say this to a woman? And you've got to figure that out for yourself. So it makes you use the language, not just repeat it. It puts you in the position of composing sentences in the language. And only after you've had your guess at how you would say it do they tell you. So it's a very good system. They start each lesson, which is like, the lessons are 30 minutes long. They start each lesson with a little conversation, and then they teach you how to understand everything in that conversation. And it's based on the things you're going to need to know the most, the first. So the first thing you learn in any Pimsleur course is how to say, excuse me. Because as a new language learner, you're going to need to say, excuse me, a lot. Both to get people's attention and to apologize for things you got wrong. But Pimsleur Modern Hebrew is a good course. There are some limitations to all of these. None of them are exactly what I would recommend if I were composing a course. One of the things, and I think there are starting to become books like this, but one of the things that I would teach differently in any of these languages is, any of these ancient languages, is I would focus on recognition rather than composition. You do learn a language better if you can compose text in that language, like figure out how would you say this, but that's not what most people wanting to read biblical Greek or Latin or Hebrew are interested in. They're not interested in composing new text. They're interested in understanding the text that's in front of them. And so if I were writing a language course on one of these languages, I would focus on here's what you need to recognize the meaning of what's in front of you. So it would be recognition based rather than teaching you how to compose in this. To give an example, like in Latin, the sound b gets shoved into verbs to make them future tense. And so you don't need to know every single thing about how to conjugate every verb in the future tense. All you got to know is if you recognize a verb, but it's got the letter B shoved into the middle of it before the ending, that makes it future tense. So you don't have to memorize a big verb paradigm. Just remember that a B in a verb, if the verb doesn't normally have a B and it's got one in there, you're looking at a future tense verb. So that will teach you to recognize future tense verbs rather than how to make future tense verbs for yourself. I also would do other things like in Greek, they have the definite article. Their equivalent of the word the is very important, and it takes on different genders. There's a masculine the, a feminine the, and a neuter the. And frequently, they will put it, when you're learning Greek vocabulary, they'll put the noun first, and then to let you know what gender it is, they'll stick the after it. So you would have, in a typical Greek vocabulary learning program, logos, which is the word for word, logos ha. And ha tells you this is a masculine word. Logos is masculine. Well, that's dumb, because you're never going to encounter logos ha when you're reading the biblical text. In Greek, it sticks the in front of the noun it modifies. So what we ought to do is teach students Greek vocabulary by putting the definite article in the correct place. Ha logos. Because that's the way you're always going to encounter it in the text. Ha logos, not logos ha. And so I think sticking the definite article on is good, but you need to stick it on in the right place where the student's actually going to encounter it, so they memorize what they're actually going to be seeing in the text. But those are my thoughts.
Brett, thank you for those questions. That does bring us to the break. We'll take a quick break. Be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Catechism in a Year with me, Father Mike Schmitz, is now available right here on Catholic Radio. Encounter God's plan of sheer goodness for us, revealed in Scripture and passed down through the tradition of the Catholic faith as we journey together toward our heavenly home.
Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it's an internet open forum. And Trey wants to know this. Is Frank J. Sheed's explanation of the Trinity good theology?
Frank J. Sheed was a 20th century apologist and author who was originally from Australia, but married an English woman and founded a publishing company called Sheed and Ward. His wife's name was Maisie Ward, and they founded a publishing company called Sheed and Ward in England. He also wrote a bunch of books, and two of his books are called Theology, Insanity, and Theology for Beginners. And both of these books contain explanations of the doctrine of the Trinity. It's been ages since I've read Sheed, but my memory is that his explanation of the Trinity is considered good. That doesn't mean perfect, and it certainly doesn't mean that everything he says about it is church teaching, but it is considered to be a good, reputable explanation of the Trinity. So with those cautions in mind, I'd say, take a look at it and see what he has to say.
Thank you, Trey. This one comes from Aaron. Does blessing something require authority over it? I wondered about this because I'm studying to become a librarian, but I currently work in the library as an assistant. Am I more qualified to bless the library as a librarian rather than just an assistant? Or as a mom, I bless my children. Can I bless other people's children?
Well, okay, so let's think about what a blessing is. The Latin word for blessing is benedictio. And that means literally from its word parts, its etymology, it means to speak good. And so what you do when you're blessing something, this is opposed to maledictio, malediction or cursing, where you speak evil of something or speak bad of it. So in a curse, what you're doing is you speak bad of it and you hope the bad thing will happen. Like some of Johnny Carson's, may 1,000 fleas infest your armpits or whatever. That would be a curse. And a blessing is the opposite, where you speak good of something in hopes that the good will happen. Like, may something nice happen to you today. So we as human beings, unless you're using psychokinesis, we as human beings don't have any ability to affect things. We can't bring about harm or good for someone just by speaking it. And so we're relying on God to bring about either the blessing or the cursing. And so the question is going to be, in terms of, is a particular blessing going to be effective? It's going to be, well, does God want to answer that prayer? Because essentially that's what you're doing when you are uttering a blessing, is you are basically praying to God. If you say, God bless you, Psychelet, what I'm doing, even though I'm addressing you, I'm really hoping God's going to do something. So it's the equivalent of saying, oh God, please have something good happen to Psychelet. So that means that in order to determine the scope of who could bless things, in principle, we can ask the question, who can pray for things? Because you could always address God directly and say, God, please may something nice happen to Psychelet today. And God could answer that prayer. But that's essentially the same thing. If I just say, may God bless you today, Psy. That's the same thing. So anybody can pray to God for good things to happen, either for themselves or others. And so anyone in principle can say a blessing on someone else. Now, that doesn't mean that they're authorized to do so in particular circumstances, like in the Mass, the priest is assigned to do blessings, and we're, as laity, are not assigned to do blessings, and we're supposed to keep to our role in the Mass. So we as laity don't give blessings during the Mass, but the priest does. But unless there's a restriction in a particular case, anybody can pray for anything. It's just like at the Mass. At Mass, the priest says the prayers. The laity don't say the prayers with the priest. But unless there's a restriction, anybody can pray for anything and anybody can bless anything. So you can bless your children. You can bless the books in your library, even if you're not the head librarian, because all you're really doing is praying to God, asking for good stuff. and anybody can do that. Having said that, some people are authorized to give blessings, like priests, and in some situations laity, including the blessing of one's own children. And so there's a certain appropriateness to people with authority over something trying to bless it. It might have a little more effect if it's coming from someone with like a parent's natural law authority over their children, or a priest's authority over his flock, or something like that. But ultimately it's up to God. So it might be more effective if someone has authority, but it can be done by anybody, and it's ultimately up to God to decide what to do.
Aaron, thank you for that question. Getting near the end, so on we go to Jean's question. I had a discussion with a Baptist who believed in Baptist successionism. Okay. I know that's been debunked, even by other Baptists.
Yep.
But he threw at me a Jesuit oath, which he claimed showed how bloodthirsty and horrible the Catholic Church is. I looked online for this and found what he was referring to, but it is so over-the-top inflammatory that I can't believe it's anything but a hoax. But he says it's real and is in the Library of Congress, as though placement there imbues the document with authenticity. Could you please tell me more about this Jesuit oath?
Sure. First, I should, though, explain what Baptist successionism is for people who don't know that term. The idea is that Baptists as a denomination have existed since the 1st century. Sometimes they'll even say they were founded by John the Baptist, hence the name. And this claim was popularized in the early 20th century by a booklet called The Trail of Blood, which was released in 1931 by a guy named James Milton Carroll, who was a Baptist minister. And in The Trail of Blood, he proposes, and he actually has a chart illustrating this, that various groups in church history, like the Bogomils and the Paulicians and so forth, were actually Baptists. They were just called something else, and they were all persecuted by the evil Catholic Church and so forth. This has been, as you say, widely debunked. What Carroll did was get groups that were disfavored and had like maybe 1 or 2 points of commonality with Baptists and said, oh, they were us. They just had a different name. Really, though, historians look at this and say, no, they're not you. They had a bunch of other beliefs, too, that are not remotely, and practices. They had beliefs and practices that are not remotely like modern Baptists. So this is just historical falderall. When it comes to the alleged Jesuit oath, yeah, it's a forgery, and it seems to have become popular in the 19th century as part of 19th century American anti-Catholicism. It's also paired sometimes with another oath attributed to the Knights of Columbus, and they're both really bloodthirsty. You know, they're swearing to, I'm going to kill Protestants and I'm going to do all this bad stuff. And I'm going to, rip out their intestines and boil them in oil and all this kind of nonsense. No modern historian takes this seriously. And you will have sometimes people say things like, oh, this is in the Library of Congress, as if that was proof it's authentic. And that sounded in the 19th century, oh, you mean Congress has this in its library? Wow, Congress is such a respected institution. Cy Kellett, is Congress today a very respected institution known for its scholarly accuracy?
It slipped a bit in that area. It slipped.
Yeah. And you know what they actually do in the Library of Congress? They register copyrights. So anything with a copyright goes into the Library of Congress. It doesn't have to be accurate. They've got the world's smallest copy of Old King Cole in the Library of Congress, but that doesn't mean Old King Cole was a real historical figure. They also maintain the congressional record in the Library of Congress, so if any crazy congressman wants to read anything out, it goes into the Library of Congress. And yeah, there have been crazy anti-Catholic congressmen who have read out the Jesuit oath before, but that doesn't mean it's accurate.
Gene, thank you. I hope that was helpful to you. That was a lot of fun. Jimmy, thanks for 2 fun hours.
My pleasure.
Even though I showed up a little late, we'll round it off to 2 hours.
You were here in spirit.
I was indeed. All right, we'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.